Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum, dubious speculation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, Ethereum it's a really interesting part of the Cryptoverse. It's number two for a reason. I do think it is going to stay number two for a very long period of time. Now, with ETH, I think a lot of people have been fairly disappointed with its price action this year because it hasn't really kept pace with a lot of the other cryptocurrencies, including and especially Bitcoin. But remember, this is fairly typical behavior for Ethereum. Even last cycle, ETH didn't put in a new all time high until January of the post halving year. And this came, well after Bitcoin had put in its own all-time high. So Ethereum tends to lag. It tends to lag Bitcoin to the point where then people think Ethereum is dead, but then it ends up waking up and then making its own move. One of the things you've probably heard me say many times over the last several years is that ETH Bitcoin should bottom between 0.03 to 0.04. And it's basically just following this same pattern that we've seen happen a number of times, where each cycle you sort of get a top and then a lower high, and then you set a low in between those two tops. And then between that, you sort of bounce back up. But then eventually, ETH Bitcoin fades back down and then goes out and takes out that low from between those two peaks. So we've seen this happen a number of times now, and arguably that's what's happening right now, right? You're seeing ETH Bitcoin drop. We saw ETH Bitcoin sort of drop below the range low. I said many times it would likely bottom between 0.03 to 0.04. And essentially it seems like that has played out. It is always possible that ETH Bitcoin goes lower, but you should be aware that most of the bottoms by ETH Bitcoin have occurred, or at least a low, not always the bottom, but a low has occurred in either December or January. For instance, in 2015, you can see that ETH Bitcoin found a bottom in October, but then it had a higher low in December. And then in 2016, ETH Bitcoin bottomed the last week of December. In 2017, you can see that ETH Bitcoin bottomed out here the first week of December. In 2019, ETH Bitcoin bottomed in September, and then it put in a higher low the last week or so of December going into early January. And then in 2021, ETH Bitcoin bottomed the last week of December going into early January. So it's very common for ETH Bitcoin to bottom out in either December or January. That doesn't always mean it's sort of the macro low. You could have a low that occurs earlier, like this one occurred in September, this one occurred in October, and then you could have sort of a higher low in December or January. Sometimes the December or January low actually goes just a bit below the prior local low. Even in 2021, you can see that ETH Bitcoin was dropping, and then it did get a little bit of a rally into late November. It held on into early December, but then by the end of December, ETH Bitcoin came down and went all the way back down to 0.02. So my general thought process on ETH Bitcoin is that there's a decent chance that the bottom is already in. If it's not in, then I imagine it would only sweep the prior low, right? So hopefully that makes sense. I don't. It's really hard to know, exactly when but the bottom is, or when it forms. There's been a lot of people that prematurely called the bottom on ETH Bitcoin all the way down, but I would argue that if it can, as long as I would argue that this is either the low. There's a good chance that's the low. If it's not the low, if for whatever reason it's not the low, then I think that ETH Bitcoin would only sweep it, like barely go below it. And that's why it's not worth really spending a lot of time worrying about, because even if it does happen, it probably wouldn't go that much below the prior low. as far as ETH Bitcoin is concerned. And one of the things I've talked about before with ETH Bitcoin is I think that you can view it two ways. You sort of view it as lower highs is sort of the pessimistic way to view it, but you can also sort of view it as higher lows. And it probably depends on what your bias is. I think you should respect both of those views, right? You can easily see the higher lows, but you can also easily see the lower highs. What I think is happening is that Ethereum is converging to whatever its fair value is against Bitcoin. So if you were to look at sort of a logarithmic regression type curve, I'm not actually coding it in, but just sort of, eyeballing it here, what it might look like. We had sort of the logarithmic regression bands for Bitcoin and for Ethereum. You could argue that you could have one for the ETH Bitcoin valuation as well, where ETH Bitcoin sort of comes back down to the fair value eventually. But anytime it comes back down here, it can spend a little bit of time down here and then it'll pop back up. So, we've spent varying times down here at the end of 2015, early 2016. We didn't really spend that much time down at this level. In late 2016, early 2017, not a lot of time. Last cycle, we did spend a lot of time down at these levels. So, again, I think the argument for me and the reason why it has made sense to own Ethereum ever since it dropped below its 0.04 level was because the low is likely going to be between 0.03 to 0.04. Now, a lot of people here aren't going to be able to appreciate this sort of discussion more than likely because they don't really necessarily think of their portfolio in terms of Satoshis. They're more so dependent on its USD valuation. And so therefore they're more interested in in this chart. Now, I make a lot of predictions. Some come right, some come true. Some are wrong. And I've made several videos sort of admitting that it never went home. And it's something I was wrong. It's sort of a blemish on the record, and that's just the way it goes. Somehow, I put out bold predictions all the time, like Bitcoin dominance to go to around 60%, ETH Bitcoin to 0.03 to 0.04. And yes, I thought Ethereum would go home on its USD pair, but it never did. And, I've said many times that it was worthwhile to start getting it as once ETH Bitcoin went below 0.03 to 0.04, or sorry, once it went below 0.04. Now, I think that if you value your portfolio in Satoshis and you just stayed Bitcoin heavy until 60% dominance, then this is okay with you because, you basically just stuck with Bitcoin and then you started to convert it to ETH down here. So it doesn't really feel like you necessarily missed out on anything. If you value your portfolio in US dollars, then obviously ETH USD put in a low all the way back over here in 2022. So it ultimately depends on how you value your portfolio. I have often said that if you value your portfolio in Satoshis, you'll probably enjoy my content a little bit more. If you value it in US dollars, you probably won't, right? Because, it's very much true that ETH USD has just been putting in higher lows since 2022. My argument was that regardless of that, it would likely put in lower highs against Bitcoin, and it dropped about 60% against Bitcoin from those highs. If you look at 2016, it actually dropped 81% against Bitcoin, and then if you look at 2017, it dropped almost 90% against Bitcoin. So even though this felt like a terrible drop by ETH Bitcoin, it's actually been one of the tamest drop, assuming that that's either the bottom or very close to the bottom, which I think it would make sense to assume that it is. If you were to look at monthly candles for ETH Bitcoin, what you'll notice is that after it breaks down, after it really breaks down, it then tends to bottom out within a few months, right? It doesn't, it can stay at those levels for a little while, but that's arguably where we are. There's always a chance that you get a move like this, where it comes back up here and then back down maybe in the summer of 2025 and then goes up again. I don't know if that's the most likely outcome, but the reason I'm at least mentioning it is because last cycle ETH Bitcoin saw a double bottom where it basically rallied back up to where it broke down from, and then it came back down. And then also in 2022, you can see that ETH Bitcoin dropped in June, right? ETH Bitcoin dropped in June of 2022. Um, and so you can also see that it dropped in June of 2016. So you could always get an outcome for ETH Bitcoin where it sort of rallies back up to maybe 0.05 and then comes back down and then goes back up in late 2025. And a lot of times you'll see ETH Bitcoin go up in the very last part of the post halving year. For instance, we saw ETH Bitcoin go up in, starting in December of 2017, January 2018. We also saw ETH Bitcoin get a rally over here in Q4 of 2021 as well. And you can see that it also dropped down in the summer of 2021. So I'm wondering if that might be the outcome to consider, sort of a rally back up, potentially a double bottom, and then it goes. But this is one of those things where if you value your portfolio in sats, it doesn't necessarily make sense to sort of wait for that double bottom, right? It could occur, but it also can make it can make sense to just have some now in case it doesn't come back down. For instance, if you were to go look at BNB Bitcoin, like take a look at BNB Bitcoin, you'll notice that it bottomed out, right? It hit a low back in December of 2023, and then it rallied, and now it looks like it's potentially finding, getting close to finding a double bottom. And so, but that process of finding that double bottom can take a long time to play out. So just because we can sort of envision it now doesn't necessarily mean it's something you should, say, wait for. Okay, so I would argue that ETH Bitcoin, the low is either in or it's extremely close to being in, right? It could always sweep the low. ETH USD has obviously been putting in higher lows for a couple of years now, right? And you can see that one of the things we talked about earlier this year back over here was that it would likely fall back into the wedge, and it did, right? It did. My thought process back then, back when ETH was at 4K, that it would fall back into the wedge, and then it would go home to the lower logarithmic regression trend line, just like it did in late 2016, right? Because that's what it did in late 2016. I just assumed that there's a chance that it could happen again. But as I mentioned, there's a difference between being right and making money. I'd rather be rich and wrong than poor and right. And when ETH Bitcoin dropped below 0.04 just a few months ago, that's when it made sense to start hedging, because I ultimately think that ETH Bitcoin bottoms out between 0.03 to 0.04. And I also value my portfolio in sats, not US dollars. So I care about this chart and finding the low on that a lot more than this chart and finding the low on that. However, you could easily argue that that is nothing more than cope, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree with you. Okay, I wouldn't disagree with you about that. I do think there are some elements of me coping in that, but I also forced myself to convert some Bitcoin to ETH at 60% Bitcoin dominance, and when ETH Bitcoin dropped below 0.04. So that's where I stand right now on ETH USD. I don't know, I don't know if it's ever going to go back home or not at this point. Maybe it'll just be the cycle that it never went home. Or, as some people have pointed out, maybe I just redraw the logarithmic regression trend line like that and we call it a day. If you go look at year-to-date ROI of Ethereum in 2024 compared to 2023, you can kind of see a very similar pattern. It's following a lot of what Bitcoin did, right? Where Bitcoin in 2024 compared to 2023 looks very similar. And I wonder, if ETH will follow something similar, where it just kind of, you can see last year it sort of rallied into this point, and then it then did get a drop, and then rallied back up, and then it sort of waited until the next year to make its move. And remember, as I said early on, it was last cycle that ETH put in its new all-time high in January of the post-halving year. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to wait until January, but January is only a few weeks away. So there's always a chance that it just sort of repeats what happened last cycle, and and follows suit in that regard. So we'll see if that pans out or not. Going back to the year-to-date ROI, you could also look at ETH Bitcoin year-to-date ROI and look at 2024 compared to 2023 and see that basically it's following exactly what it did back then, right? It's almost a carbon copy of it. We've also compared 2024 to 2019, and it followed it fairly closely for a long time. And so I think that and even 2018, you could argue that ETH Bitcoin, the years that look the most like this for ETH Bitcoin are 2018, 2019, and 2023 and 2024, right? I mean, these all years where ETH Bitcoin dropped. But I think that ETH Bitcoin should do better in 2025. That doesn't mean you have to wait until 2025 to see it do better. I think it bottoms out. It could bottom out before 2025. But if you look at 2021 and 2017, ETH Bitcoin went up in post-halving years. So my argument is that probably ETH Bitcoin will go up in 2025 as well. So those are my general thoughts about ETH USD. I know a lot of people have, and I've had different people reach out and sort of say different things. Some people have been really happy that the ETH Bitcoin narrative came true and Bitcoin dominance did go to 60%. They were able to convert and preserve the Satoshi valuation of their portfolio. Other people, honestly, have been very upset that ETH USD never went home. And I've tried to come on here and sort of admit it and hold my hand up high many times, but I don't think I don't think I'll ever escape it. So I've learned one thing, and that is, on here we are definitely more so a slave to our wrong predictions than people caring about the right ones. So all I can do is, say I was wrong about that and move on with my life. And hope that ETH Bitcoin has bottomed out at 0.03 to 0.04. And if it does, repeat last cycle, then just know that it could get a bounce sort of back up to that level, and then it might come back down and then go up. Just keep that in mind. It doesn't have to. I mean, if you look at the 2016 cycle, it just went up, right? So that's why I'm saying it might be foolish to assume that it has to come back down. There's no guarantee that it makes this move immediately either. As I said, like in late 2020, we also saw a similar move where it started to move and it felt like it was time, and then it still got one more sell off before then the real move started. So don't necessarily discount that idea, but it certainly seems like the low for ETH Bitcoin is either in or very, very close to being in. If you were to look at ETH Bitcoin, you can see that it is now, gotten back above sort of this this low here, right? You could see that it dropped here, it came back up, dropped again, now it's back above it once again. I guess you could argue that it's potentially trying to get above that. So let's see. I mean, if it can get back up to like say 0.041, 0.042, then that's even more confirmation that the low is likely in. If it gets rejected here, maybe Bitcoin starts to move again, then it's always possible it sweeps the prior low. But that's where I stand on ETH USD, noting that ETH USD is still tracking what it did in 2023. More or less, right? More or less. It kind of had a rally up. It then stalled out, within a couple of days, got a pullback, and then went back up again. Is essentially what happened. And if we go over to the asset filter over here and look at Ethereum, and we go look at the running 1-year ROI, you can see that it's basically just been around 1.5 or so for a number of years now, right? So almost wonder if you could sort of connect these peaks and then these lows and come up with some type of interesting measure. Also, the other thing to look at is if you look at monthly average, or sorry, not monthly average ROI. If you look at monthly returns for ETH Bitcoin, right? You can see that normally post-halving years is mostly green. 2021, 2017, and you can see that 2024 has been mostly red for ETH Bitcoin. So I would guess that 2025 will be mostly green for ETH Bitcoin. and again, remember ETH USD is obviously different. ETH USD will be more so dependent on ETH or on Bitcoin USD, whereas ETH Bitcoin will likely go up in 2025 regardless of the direction of Bitcoin USD. It's basically the opposite of what we've been saying for the last 3 years, right? For the last 3 years, it was that ETH Bitcoin would go down no matter the direction of Bitcoin USD. Now I think it's the opposite. It's ETH Bitcoin will go up no matter the direction of Bitcoin USD in 2025. The other thing to note is that historically, the first 5 months of the year tend to be green for Ethereum, and the last 7 months of the year tend to be red, right? And you can even see that June through October was red, November was green. So far, December is green, but we're only 1 weekend, so we still have quite a ways to go to sort of figure out if 2024 December will in fact be green. The other thing that I wanted to mention is you could look actually at alts, against Ethereum as well. So you, instead of looking at it against Bitcoin, you could look at it against Ethereum. And one of the interesting things about this is that alts sort of broke out here against ETH, which is why it certainly feels like ETH has not been keeping pace, like it's been lagging behind. But note that this is basically the same level that alts went to in 2022 against ETH, right? It's basically the same level. And then ultimately they did get rejected. So as I've said before, if Bitcoin's the dog, when the dog's away, the cat will play ETH. If the cat's away, the mice will play, and that's when the altcoins come out. So if Ethereum starts to move, altcoins take a back seat. If Bitcoin makes a move, then everything takes a back seat. But that's arguably where we are right now. So hopefully this content is useful to you guys. And I try to be as honest as I can when I get things wrong. And ETH USD, as I mentioned, right, it never did go home. Hopefully, if you followed the strategy that I presented of just staying Bitcoin heavy until 60% dominance, you're able to get some ETH, between 0.03 to 0.04 as it relates to its Bitcoin pair. And again, I'm sorry that it never went home on its USD pair. That was my own mistake. Anyways, we'll wrap it up there, guys. Thank you for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and again, I will see you guys next time. Bye.